So let's talk about different perspectives of supply chain management. How can I visualize supply chains? And there's a bunch of different ways. The most common way is to look at the geographic flows. And when anyone describes their supply chain, typically the first thing they do is they draw a map. And what I'm showing here is a screenshot from a research initiative up here at MIT called the High-Vis project. And what we did in this project, we tried to understand the physical flow of different products. They were mapped directly onto this geographic map, and the idea was we could identify sources of risk. So this would show products from their original source all the way to their manufacturing process and through to their final consumption. And the idea is if I know there's a certain risk in a different part of the world, I can assess what the value at risk is for my whole company. So this perspective of a physical flow over a map is very common. And in fact, it's a really good way when you want to talk to someone about their supply chain is just ask them to map it out. Another common way is to look at this simple diagram. And here, this is kind of a product flow diagram, where again, the product almost always goes from left to right, from raw materials to your finished goods. And remember, this going from left to right is downstream. And so I talk about my downstream supply chain, I mean my customers. Think of the products flowing like a river. And so this is another good way, if you're talking to someone about their supply chain, just ask them, start talking to them about, who are your suppliers? Where are they located? How many do you have? Then you ask them about their plants, their manufacturing plants. How many do you have? You ask about their distribution centers and how those operate. And then you ask about the customers that they serve. So this is a very nice framework to think about how to describe a supply chain, because you're covering it from end to end. And it's a good framework to help you understand how the product flows. Another nice way to look at this is through cycles. And there's different cycles in a supply chain. And so we can think of the one we're most familiar with as customers, and that's what's known as the customer order cycle. So think about it this way. If I'm a customer and I'm going to, say, a coffee shop, I'm going to arrive, I'm going to place my order, I'm going to hopefully receive my order or have it fulfilled, and even better, I'm going to actually pay for that. And so if I look at this cycle, every kind of order cycle follows this. I have to arrive, I have to place the order, it gets fulfilled, and I pay. Think about how it's different for an internet versus a bricks and mortar kind of retail experience. You physically arrive for a bricks and mortar retailer versus going to a website. You place your order, you go and pick what's there, and in a bricks and mortar retailer, you fulfill it yourself, you pick it off the shelf, and you pay there. For an online experience, it's a little bit different. A lot of this happens, it's delayed. You might pay immediately, but you don't get fulfilled until later. So you can think about this order cycle and how they differ between different supply chains. Now there's more than just this one order cycle. The idea is there's multiple of these, and you can think about the replenishment cycle for how the retailer gets replenished from its distributor. But again, they have the same thing. They place the order, somehow it gets fulfilled, and sometimes there's a payment. Then I can look at the manufacturer, and it's the same thing. The distributor here would place an order with the manufacturer. It might have to be scheduled into production because now I don't have it necessarily there as inventory. I might need to make it, so I have to tie into a production plan, and then it gets delivered to that distributor. And you can carry this on and finally think about a end supplier. I could have 2 chains, I could have 20 chains. It depends on the type of product and the complexity of that product. But the interesting thing is all the cycles occur between these different stages. And not every supply chain will have 4, but they'll have some level. And again, when I talk about this, I'm talking, it's kind of strange here, going like this is going upstream. And so as I move upstream from my customer to my retailer to distributor to manufacturer to supplier, you can think of the lead time of fulfilling gets longer, right? Because if I come in to that coffee shop, I expect to get my order fulfilled immediately. Well, it might take a longer time for that retailer to get fulfilled from the distributor, longer even from the manufacturer to that distributor, and so on. Also, you can think about as I go, again, upstream from customer to supplier, my order size increases. And this is important because sometimes you'll see different members or parties in the supply chain want to work directly with the customer. So as I move upstream again from customer to supplier, my order gets bigger, my order size, because here in the customer size, I'm generally ordering eaches. I go in and buy 1 tube of toothpaste, maybe 1 gallon of milk. As I move to this replenishment cycle, the retailer might order cases or pallets of product from its distributor. The distributor might order full truckloads, or might have to order full truckloads of product from the manufacturer. And then that manufacturer might order train loads or rail loads or full truckloads, certainly, of raw material for its manufacturing process. So my order size gets bigger, which means I get a lot lumpier. And we'll talk more about this and the idea of the bullwhip effect. And as I move, again, upstream my supply chain, the interactions get a little bit different, a little choppier. So we'll talk more about that in future lectures. But let me give you another perspective here, and this is one that most software vendors take. And if you're a software vendor, you think of 3 types of people that you're dealing with. You've got a supplier, you've got the firm, and you've got their customers. So you can think of 3 main classes of software that are in there. And let me talk about each of them. The first is this SRM, Supplier Relationship Management, and the idea is to manage this relationship between the firm and its suppliers. This is all about procurement, sourcing, negotiations, how you collaborate on supply things, how you manage your suppliers. The next category, internal supply chain management, is all the things that the firm needs to make, move, and store its own products, the logistics within the firm. So you can think about strategic planning, fulfillment, transportation management, inventory management, all those kind of things that the firm needs to, again, manage its own internal supply chain. And then the last bucket is dealing with this interface between the customer and the firm. This is customer relationship management, and it deals with marketing, selling, call centers, order management, anything dealing with the customer. Now when you look at this, you think you can't really keep them this separated. You can't keep them this siloed because they all interdepend with each other. Demand planning is critical, of course, to the customer. You need to have a good handle on the customer to understand your demand planning. Same thing with supply planning. In fact, these 2 processes together, demand and supply planning, come together in a process we'll talk about in a couple lectures called Sales and Operations Planning, or S&OP process. Because one of the challenges that a firm has is balancing what we're telling our customers up here and what we're able to deliver from our suppliers and internally down here. And so one of the things that supply chains need to manage is to balance that supply and the demand and how that manages. So one of the main roles of supply chains is to coordinate that interaction between those. Another very popular perspective is the Supply Chain Operations Reference, or SCORE model. You'll see this a lot. This is developed by the Supply Chain Council, and the Supply Chain Council really pioneered this concept of having metrics that span an entire supply chain. Because think about it, up until like the early 90s, mid 1990s, each company had its own metrics for its own operations. But if you have a supply chain, sometimes the metrics for individual companies would interfere with a supply chain wide or end-to-end performance. And so what the Supply Chain Council came up with is very clever, a set of metrics and supporting documentation and processes that help you manage a supply chain as a whole. And it's called the SCORE model. And the hallmarks of it is to think of it in 3 big processes: source of material, making materials, delivering materials, and then you've also got this planning process which kind of supersedes it. And then they've added in the last several years this whole idea of returning and recycling and things like that. But the idea of source, make, deliver is a really great framework to think about, especially when you talk to someone about their supply chain. You ask them about their sourcing, their making, and their delivering, and it helps you understand what they do differently within their supply chain. One last point about this is that they separate out the types of supply chain into 3 big categories. One is the idea of making to stock or delivering to stock. And this is the idea where I'm delivering and making things to go into inventory. So I don't know what the demand's going to be. I don't know for sure. I'm guessing what that's going to be. I have a forecast. So I'm making it to put it into stock. The next category is making it to order. This is where I only make something when I have a physical order for it. I don't do it unless someone says they want it. And you can think about all the different ramifications, and we'll talk more about this in later lectures. And then the idea of engineering to order, where not only do I not start making it until someone places an order for it, the form of it might be different. It might be unique to them. I start figuring out exactly what they need when that order is placed. So the SCORE model is very powerful, and I encourage you to go check out the material on their website, the Supply Chain Council. But unfortunately, in most companies, you have a very different perspective for supply chain in that it's mainly functional. Most companies, while they have supply chains, they're not always in an organizational function called supply chain. They might be interspersed, but generally a supply chain consists of these individual functions. So it goes from purchasing and procurement. These are the guys who determine what to buy from who, and the real challenge is to determine whether this is a corporate function or falls within each group or business unit. There's a group that looks at inventory control that determines how much inventory to stock where, when to replenish, what the trigger points are. There's a group that looks at all the warehousing and distribution centers and mixing centers and storage areas. How do I actually physically store things? How do I mix things? What do I stock where in the warehouse? There's also materials handling, and these people deal with things within the warehouse, but also things like packaging. How do I set up my packaging? How do I make sure that I minimize damage, but also minimize the volume? They also look at the layout of the storage and kind of how to move the product within the facilities. There's also going to be a group that does order processing. These are the people who receive the orders, enter the orders, and maintain the status of those orders, and the whole idea of order management from time it was placed until it's finally fulfilled. Then there's a transportation group, and you can think of it in many different ways. One classic way is to think inbound versus outbound. Inbound means any product that's coming to me. Outbound means anything that's leaving me. So you can think of inbound things coming from your upstream supply chain partners. Outbound are the things going to your downstream supply chain partners. You can also think of it, and many companies break it up into domestic versus international. Things within my country and things that cross borders. Because once you cross a border, things get very tricky and there's a lot of other things that need to be considered. You can also think of it broken up by different modes of transportation, whether it's railroads, full truckload trucking, less than truckload trucking, parcel deliveries of small items, air, whatever, ocean, all these different modes. Sometimes they're organized differently. I can think of customer service, and the challenge here, what many people have questions on, is it a geographically focused one? I have customer service in each geographic region, or do I have customer service aligned by different products? Each of my different product lines has its own customer service group. You can see there's trade-offs either way. And then almost every company will have some kind of planning group that kind of covers all of these activities, and they deal with facility location, network design, demand planning, a lot of the analysis that helps companies decide how to structure their whole supply chain. So these are the functional areas, but I showed you a whole bunch of different perspectives that you can think about when you talk about someone and talk about your own supply chain. It's valuable because it gives you a framework to think about when you talk about your supply chain.